I'm going to talk to you about what's new in iOS, but not in iOS 18, but rather in older versions, iOS 17, 16, and 15. So just to introduce myself, so I'm Vincent, I'm talking to you from France. As Chris said, I'm a content creator, and I also work for an app called Photoroom, which is an AI photo editor, which is available on the App Store. If you want to try it, please be my guest. And the content I'm about to show you is some new content that I will be presenting in a bit more than a week at TriSwift Tokyo. That's why you can see my name written on Japanese on the slide, actually. So first time I'm doing it, please bear with me if there is any technical hiccups in the slides. So let's get started. Why did I choose this topic? It's basically because every WWDC follows the same pattern. You've got some really exciting announcements. A few of them you can start using right now, mostly if they are about the Swift language. Sometimes now some features can be backported to older versions of iOS, typically when there is a new method in an existing class. Now Swift can support that, but besides that, every WWDC, the bulk of it is new API that you cannot use yet. And it creates this weird situation where all of the big new APIs, they eventually get adopted. Think things about like Combine, Swift UI, the new state observability pattern in Swift UI, they get adopted because they are just so big. But there is a lot of smaller APIs that basically don't get to build momentum when they are announced because of their requirement of the new iOS version. And by the time when most people can actually use them, they just fade into the shadows. And unless you actually search for them, you're not aware of them. So I made some selections for this talk, and we're going to cover some of these APIs, starting by ones that were introduced in iOS 15. So iOS 15 is 4 versions ago, if I count the fact that iOS 19 will be coming pretty soon. So I would say a good part of iOS apps today can use these APIs, and there are some which are pretty interesting. So let's start by one that if you follow my content, you've probably already seen. If that's the case, I want to reassure you, most of the content is new. This is just one case where I reused some existing content. So it's a modifier called privacy sensitive in Swift UI. And the idea is that you can add this modifier to any view in Swift UI. And when you do, as soon as your app leaves the foreground, the content of the view will be automatically masked. So the idea is that if in your app there is some information which is privacy sensitive, you can mark it that way, and then you don't have to worry about your user putting the app in the background and then they show their phone to someone and some information gets displayed when it shouldn't have. So most of the time, apps which are very private, like banking apps, they just are going to hide the whole app. But it can happen that in your app, maybe there are things which are a bit private. I'm going to give an example which might seem a bit funny, but something that can happen. Imagine that you are an app where you can order things online and you have some products which are adult only. Maybe you want to hide them on the order history when the user goes into the background. It can also be used if you have a widget which is displayed on the home screen, and then this modifier will hide the information when the user is not actively looking at the screen. One thing to keep in mind though, it will not have an impact on screenshots. The idea behind it, from what I understand, is that a screenshot is an intentional action from the user, and here the goal is rather to prevent the user from unintentionally showing their private information. If you want to hide something on screenshot, you need to intercept the fact that the screenshot is happening and then manually hide the contents of the view. Moving on to the next one, which is an API to better format dates, or rather format them without using the very famous date formatter. So this is code that uses a date formatter, very familiar code. And actually, maybe some of you have spotted a mistake in this code, which is that I'm using capital Ds. And as you can see, if you run this, so I made the slides a few weeks ago, but if you run this, you will see that you get a very weird numbering for the number of the day, like 61. And there is no month in the year with 61 days. And the reason is because capital D actually gives you the number of the day relative to the beginning of the year. So here it was a day in March, and so it was the 61st day the 61st day as since the beginning of the year. Of course, it's not what you want in most cases. In most cases, you want to use lowercase d to have the actual number of the day in the month. Same thing for the year, where capital Y is also not what you want. I won't go into the details of it because it's a bit complex, but it can give you very weird results when you are at the end of a year. All that to say that date formatter is great, but it's also super error prone. And there is actually a better choice now in Swift and in Foundation because you can use the API formatted. So you can call it on a date and it will format it by default using the local of the user. So typically, if you're in the US, you will have the month first. Here, I made my code run on a computer that was running with a French local. So that's why I have the day first. You can use formatted just like that. You can also give it some arguments, for instance, to say that you only want the date in numerics and to omit the time. You can say that you want that day time, the day on 2 digits, and then the month on what is called a wide preset, which is to have it fully spelled out. You can also go into more fancy things. For example, if you want the information of having the number of the day relative to the beginning of the year, you can ask for it, although you get some kind of weird formatting, which kind of hints at the fact that this is not meant to be user-facing, but that's possible. This also works not only with dates, but also with numbers. For example, you can format a number without having going to the APIs that are going to take a flag, kind of like the printf-like APIs. And also, you can use it for arrays and collections where you can format and it will take care of putting the right commas and also putting an and or a or at the end of the list. That can be quite useful. Moving on to something more UI related in Swift UI is that you have something called toggle style, which you can apply to a button. And the idea is that if you want a toggle to behave more like something where when you click on it, it gets highlighted and then it becomes blend again when you click on it again, you can do it by adding the toggle style button to a toggle and it will look something like this. So typically, imagine like if you want to make a music app, probably if you want to enable shuffle mode, it's a typical example where this kind of button would work much better on a toggle where you have the little switch. Before you had to implement it yourself, now it's a built-in style available in SwiftUI since iOS 15. Now let's move on to iOS 16, a more recent OS, but an OS that apps that are targeting the more recent versions of iOS might still be able to use as of right now. So in iOS 16, there is a very interesting API called UI hosting configuration, which allows you to use SwiftUI inside a UIKit table view or collection view. So let's take this example, typical table view code where you are creating the cell in table view cell for row at index path. What you can do now is that you can set the content configuration. So this API was already there since iOS 14, but now you can give it a UI hosting configuration, which allows you to pass a SwiftUI view. So it behaves very similarly to UI hosting controller, which already enables you to use a SwiftUI view in place of a UI view controller, except that here it's for a table view or a collection view, and it's a really nice way to introduce some SwiftUI to a UIKit app, provided that it supports iOS 16 or above. And you can really do some pretty interesting things. For example, you can put buttons, or you can even use the modifier like the one to listen to swipe actions. So typically to be able to swipe a cell and display a button. So if you have a UIKit app and you want to put some SwiftUI into it and you're fortunate that you support iOS 16 and above, that's a great way to do it. And if you don't, that might also be a good way to convince like your product manager and your stakeholders to switch to iOS 16 so that you can start putting some SwiftUI without too much of a technical refactor. Next, we have a really nice API on text field, which allows the text field to grow vertically. So this is super useful whenever you want your user to write something a bit long, but you don't want to go and get out the big gun of using a text view. So the basic text field, it grows horizontally in the sense that if you write and you go past its frame, then, well, it will start to scroll the content horizontally. That's not the best experience when your user wants to write some content that can be a bit long. And typically, it can happen quite easily. Imagine a user that needs to input like some kind of address. For example, address can run quite long depending on where you live. And so you can now in iOS 16 pass the argument axis when you create the text field. Say you want the axis to be vertical. And when you do that, the text field will grow and scroll vertically. That's a really, really nice API. And the best thing is that it's great for your user. And also as a developer, it can save you really a lot of time because we all know that managing this kind of vertical scroll in a text field, if you don't have a built-in API, can take a lot of time for something that is not the most interesting task from a developer point of view. Then we have a nice little API on colors that allow you to get a gradient super easily. And by super easily, I mean by just calling one property. So here I'm filling a rectangle with the blue solid color from SwiftUI. And if I call the property gradient on it, now I get a gradient. So I hope that with the video compression, it still shows the fact that it's a gradient. It's quite subtle, but it does give a bit of a gradient vibe, and it can be quite useful. Sorry. If, for example, you're working on your own app or you're prototyping, in the sense that if you work with designers, they will always provide you with color codes for the gradients, simply because they will make the gradient in Figma and you will have the color codes there. But if you're working on your own project and you just need to have a gradient because it makes more sense for you, now you can get it with just calling one property, and you don't have to worry about getting a color code, having to go to a website like color.adobe.com to get some nice looking color codes. And here you can see an example where it's applied on more than one color. Then let's move on to iOS 17. So we get into the recent stuff, but if you're fortunate to work on an app that supports the current and the previous version of iOS, it's still something that you can use today. And if not, maybe you will be able to use it starting in September when iOS 19 drops. So the first one is about content unavailable view. So I'm sure you're already aware with content unavailable view, which allows you to have a built-in view for when there is no content, which is always much better than just showing a blank screen. But I wasn't aware of it until I started doing some research. There is actually a static property on content unavailable view, which allows you to get a specific version of it that makes sense when you're in the case of a search. And it will be tailored to the fact that there is no result for the search, and you can even pass it whatever was the search of the user, and it will add this in the view. So really useful if you want to implement this feature, because you get a really nice feature and you don't need to do a lot of extra work for it. So I think it's a really nice feature, typically if you're working again on your own app, on your own prototype, because it allows you to elevate the user experience and the level of quality that will be perceived for your app without too much effort on your end. Then we have also a really interesting view if you work on an app and you want to integrate in-app purchases. So it's all of the store view, and there are many variants. So here I'm showing subscription store view, which is for the case where your in-app purchase is a subscription, but there is also a version for it when it's a one-time purchase. And this is basically a built-in paywall in SwiftUI. You just pass it the ID of your in-app purchase or purchases, and it will generate a fully working paywall and also a fully compliant paywall, in the sense that it shows all of the information that Apple requires. So you have all of the currency properly displayed. You have the information about when it will renew per month, etc. It even shows once you're subscribed which is the plan of the user, and it also allows the user to upsell to another plan if they want. So you really get a lot of features for just using a built-in view. What's nice is that you also get to customize it. For example, you can display a button if you want to give the user the option to restore purchases that they could have made in the past. And you even have some hooks for analytics. So you can pass in closures that will be called whenever the user starts a purchase and then completes it. So if you want to implement a conversion funnel, which is quite common when you start to introduce in-app purchases, you can do it also with this paywall with built-in APIs. And I didn't like show it, but you can go much further than what I made in terms of like how you can configure the paywall. It works on macOS and on watchOS. So there is a pretty great session at WWDC like 2 years ago. If you're working on an app with in-app purchase, I really recommend that you have a look at it because paywalls can take a lot of time and energy, especially around app review, and this can really save you a lot of trouble. Moving on to the next, which is scroll target behavior. So it's a new API that allows you to refine how scrolling works with scroll views and basically to kind of like do something similar to what you could do in UIKit with paging mode enabled on a scroll view. So here I've created an horizontal scroll view in SwiftUI, and you can see that I can scroll however I want, meaning that I can let go of the scroll whenever I want. But maybe there are situations where you want to actually let go on the scroll, and then you have the scroll view stop exactly at the beginning of a new view. It could make sense if you're showing products, for example, or even if you're showing maybe like a carousel and you want to have this kind of UI where there is always one view that is fully readable. You can do it now by using this API where you mark each of the views that are going to be target layout in the scroll view. So here I apply this modifier to each of the H tags. And then you can call scroll target behavior on the scroll view to tell it how it should behave. Here I chose paging, and it will make it so that now I can only let go of the scroll once I have passed at least one full width of the view. So you can only scroll by intervals of one full width of the viewport of the scroll view, we could say. You can customize this behavior because you could say instead that you want to be view aligned. And this means that when you let go of the scroll view will automatically align with the beginning of the new view. So it could make sense also depending on what you're trying to implement. I'm just going to reshow it. And what's really nice is that if you try to implement this behavior manually, you would have to deal with things like a scroll view reader, which is not always the kind of code you want to write because it's complex, it's error prone, and you're never sure it's going to behave correctly from one version of SwiftUI to another. And now you've got it built in into SwiftUI. We're getting close to the end of what I wanted to show you, but I've got still a few more. So this one, container relative frame, is really nice because it allows you to get rid of geometry reader in a wide variety of situations. So let's imagine this view here where I'm displaying a few views stacked on top of each other. And now let's imagine that I want to create a relative. Sorry, I missed something. Yes, so I wanted to display 3 views inside a stack view, and I wanted to do it in a way where each of these views that don't have an intrinsic size only take a third of the space available. If you want to do it until iOS 17, you need to use a geometry reader so that you can have access to the height of the encompassing view. So that's the typical trick of using a geometry reader whenever you want to do some relative layout. But now you can get rid of this geometry reader, and instead you can call container relative frame on the inner view. And sorry, you can say that you want this relative layout to be vertical, and you can give the count. You say that you have 3 views that you are displaying, you want no spacing, and this will result in saying that each of the colors will take a third of the space available. So it does the same thing than the geometry reader, except that you don't need to use one, which both simplifies the code and also kind of like avoids all of the situations where a geometry reader ends up like breaking your layout when you introduce it after the fact. And another modifier which is quite similar is visual effects. So here you can see that I've stacked more colored views, and I'm going to use a geometry reader to do an effect where the more we get down, the more we want to apply a rotation to the view. As you can see, when I apply the geometry reader, I do get my effect, but you can see that the views are not placed at the exact same location. If you've used the Geometry Reader, you won't be surprised by it because Geometry Reader tends to break your layout ever so subtly, but in a way that can be very annoying because you need to build around it to get the layout that you want. And if you introduce a Geometry Reader after the fact, it's annoying because it will break your existing working layout. Well, now you don't need a Geometry Reader for this use case. Instead, you can use I did a layer where it showed the space occupied by the geometry reader, and you can see that it's occupying a bit more extra space, and it's not clear why it's doing so. And now what you can do is that you can use the modifier visual effect, which gives you a proxy, so similar to what a geometry reader does, but this time this proxy is scoped to the view. And thanks to this proxy, what you can do is that you can get the coordinates of the view in the global coordinate system that allows you to implement the effect I wanted. So the more we go down in the view and the more we want the rotation to be with an important angle, but we don't need to use the geometry reader anymore. It's much more scoped. And what's nice is that if we introduce these visual effects after the view has already been built, we won't have this annoying effect of the geometry reader changing the layout and we have to build around it. And I think this might be the last one. It's a modifier called content transition, which allows you to animate changes in text. So here I've put a simple SwiftUI app where you have a button that generates a new number randomly. By default, since I'm using with animation, SwiftUI will apply the default transition between two views, which is a cross dissolve. And if you use the modifier content transition on the text view, it will automatically and nicely, let me just replay the video, it will automatically and nicely animate in a way that is visually pleasing the change in the content of the text. Pretty good looking, and you have also some interesting options, like if you're implementing a countdown, you can set countdown true, and it will make the animation go in a way where the numbers, they rotate towards the bottom, kind of like the old alarm clocks would do it. And you've got something that is also pretty nice looking without too much effort, which is always nice when you need to develop the feature. And this time, that's the end. So that's all I wanted to show you. So thank you all for your attention. If there are questions, I'm available to answer them. I couldn't look at the chat while I was giving the talk, but I will have a look now. And just before I finish, if you want to stay up with me, I've put a link to my website. I have many outlets, including a newsletter. So if you want to have news from me most Mondays morning, you can subscribe. And if you want to learn more about Photo, which is a pretty cool app, but also a pretty cool company, I've put the link to our website. Thank you all.